One of the main questions that we've been focusing in the last year was about tinnitus in people who've got normal hearing sensitivity. So, because normally in people with tinnitus, you also have some degree of hearing loss, and in most cases you can identify hearing loss or damage to the inner ear as a trigger for tinnitus. But there are those who have perfectly normal audiograms, so their hearing thresholds are fine, but they still have got tinnitus, and that's been a question that has been bugging tinnitus research for quite some time, because you either have to assume that there's two different triggers for tinnitus, one is hearing loss and one not, or that we've been missing something. Here you see me all prepped up for an auditory brainstem response experiment. You see there are 3 electrodes attached to my skin here, and when I put on a pair of headphones and start listening to sound, then these electrodes will pick up the signals generated by my auditory brainstem, so by the first processing stages of my auditory system. It's the electrical activity generated by the nerve cells in my brain. We did those tests on people with tinnitus and a normal audiogram, and the interesting thing is that we found a remarkable difference to people without tinnitus, in that the signal that is generated by the auditory nerve that we pick up with these electrodes was smaller than in the control participants without tinnitus. So basically, even though their hearing thresholds are normal, the auditory nerve is producing a smaller signal. Interestingly, the signal that was generated in the brain itself, so originating, for example, somewhere down here in the auditory brainstem, was of a normal size, so that there was some kind of compensation for the reduced signal from the auditory nerve. So as if the brain turns up the volume control to compensate, to listen harder, so to say, to the auditory nerve, and thus generate a signal of normal size. The thing is that this listening harder, this amplification, we believe can also give rise to tinnitus, because then the brain starts also amplifying the neuronal noise, so the spontaneous activity of the nerve cells. And if you start hearing your spontaneous activity because it's increased, you hear sound in silence, you hear tinnitus. If the gain is already cranked up back down there, and if tinnitus is already generated down there, we might have a chance of finding a way of influencing the process at a very early level. So currently, for the next year, we're looking at ways of influencing the processes down there in the brainstem, for example, through acoustic or electric or stimulation, or by pharmacological means. Basically, we hope that if we can really identify how to influence the plasticity mechanisms that give rise to tinnitus, that we'll in the future might even be able to develop something like a pill for tinnitus, or if it's not a pill, some other way of effectively influencing the tinnitus, of making it quieter. It might be that it's not something that completely abolishes the tinnitus, but I believe that for many sufferers already something that makes it quieter in a reliable way would already be very desirable. So here we are in the anechoic chamber of the Ear Institute, the most quiet room we've got on offer. It's not only shielded from outside sounds through thick walls, but it also has got these foam triangles on the walls that absorb all reflections. So when I'm standing here, it's all quiet around me. And actually, when you hear nothing, that kind of triggers a reaction from your brain. If you put someone in here who doesn't have tinnitus, who's got normal hearing, and let them stand here for a few minutes, at some point in time they might start to perceive phantom sounds, and when you ask them to describe it, the phantom sounds, they say might, for example, ringing, hissing, whistling, very, very similar to how people describe their tinnitus. Those are studies that have been done already in the 50s, when showing that when you really deprive people of the auditory signal coming in, so kind of almost like giving them an absolute hearing loss for a few minutes, they start hearing tinnitus. So it might just be a reaction of the brain to this absence of input, because their hearing ability, their inner ears, they are completely normal. We've done a similar study, but with a twist. That was a project that we did together with Kevin Munro of the University of Manchester. He has been studying earplug plasticity for quite some time. So when you put an earplug in the participant's ear to see what changes in the auditory system. And quite a lot of time, his participants said that they were hearing some phantom sounds while the earplug was in. So we ran a study on that. We had 18 participants in total, and after 1 week of wearing the earplug, 11 of them said they were hearing phantom sounds, and we characterize those phantom sounds the same way we would characterize them in a tinnitus patient, and the results we got were very, very similar. So what we did there was we had participants with completely normal hearing. We put an earplug in, simulated a mild hearing loss, and they started perceiving phantom sounds. And when the earplug was taken out again, the phantom sounds disappeared. So apparently it's possible to induce phantom sounds by simulating hearing loss, and when you cure the hearing loss by taking the earplug out, the phantom sounds disappear. This tells us a lot about how tinnitus might be induced by a reaction of the brain to reduce signal from the auditory nerve. The only unfortunate thing is that we are not yet able to just cure the hearing loss. So in the last year there have been several very interesting studies on the mechanisms of tinnitus. Most of them have been laboratory studies, and they point into a direction that the plastic changes in the brain that give rise to tinnitus could all be explained by an attempt of the brain to compensate for a reduction of signal coming from the ears, for example, when you've got a hearing loss. And what they've seen is that the nerve cells in the brain receive less inhibition, so they become more active. But the problem with less inhibition is also that they start amplifying noise, which then could give rise to the tinnitus. So because one theory about tinnitus is that you just perceive the neuronal noise in your brain, and that's why you hear the tinnitus when it's quiet, even though there is no sound coming into your brain. You're just hearing your brain work, actually. So, and these studies have unveiled more details about how these processes work, and so we are now beginning really to understand what the functional objective of the brain is that activates all these plasticity mechanisms, and that tinnitus might just be an undesired side effect of this normal working of the brain, which is challenged with a situation like hearing loss, and then tries to adjust, but as a side effect generates a tinnitus.